In this video, I will explore how the greed of Mexico's leaders has throughout the years impacted the Mexican people by creating poverty, political corruption, and government impunity in the country. The threat of interference of stronger foreign powers, often including France, Spain, England, and the United States, has constantly pressured Mexico's leaders to make impulsive decisions in an effort to become strong enough, thereby prevent further intervention from powerful foreign countries. Political corruption is not unique to the Mexican government, but though other governments have also been stained with corruption, they have been able to progress socially and economically. Yet, Mexico has not been able to progress because the lust for ambition blinds political leaders from making sound political decisions. Often, leaders stall progress and regress the country into worse economic situations. Therefore, understanding Mexico's current quagmire of impunity requires analysis of the complicated history of the weakness of the Mexican state. In 1821, Mexico gained its independence from Spain, though since the start of the Revolutionary War, the country had been divided. Royalists supported rule by the mother country, but liberals opposed it. Royalists, however, joined the Revolutionary Army against Spain after an era of new liberal reforms were passed in Spain. Originally a loyalist, Iturbide joined Guerrero, a revolutionary general. Iturbide presented the Plan of Iguala on February 24, 1821. The Plan of Iguala proclaimed three guarantees, which were immediate independence from Spain, equality for Spaniards and Creoles with granted upper-class status, and the supremacy of the Roman Catholic Church and a ban on all other religions. In 1821, the last Spaniard viceroy was forced to sign the Treaty of Cordoba, and so began Mexico's independence. Now, the most important thing to note about Mexico's independence is the Plan of Iguala. The plan prioritized Spanish and Creole citizens over the majority of the population, which was of Native American or African descent. This distinction would divide the country for years to come, because power would often be limited to politicians of European descent. In 1822, Iturbide declared himself ruler of Mexico, but when he proved unable to bring order and stability to the country, all parties soon turned against him. Santa Anna, along with Guadalupe Victoria, began to push against Iturbide's government. Victoria became Mexico's first elected president, serving from 1824 through 1829. He focused his presidency on getting other nations to recognize Mexico as an independent country. He obtained a loan from England, who helped to expel Spain from Mexico. He created the merchant navy to stimulate international trade. Although in foreign affairs, Victoria managed to much better and establish relations with all other major powers, he was not particularly suited for the presidency. The inexperienced administrator was not able to deal effectively with the constant political bickering and Byzantine machinations of government rivals, often being taken advantage of by those he trusted. After roughly 8 years of independence, the Mexican people still saw no political or economic stability or progress. Throughout the years, political instability and conflict continued, but slowly Mexico began to experience conflict with its neighbor, the United States. Both countries went to war over land disputes. Mexico lost to America, and it cost the country much of its territory. Mexico was forced to sell the land it lost to the United States for around $15 million. In 1857, reform was introduced in Mexico. Defeat in the war against the United States prompted a new era of reform. Division within the country continued. A regional resistance to the strict centralized regime of the aging Santa Anna led to guerrilla warfare and eventually to the general's forced exile and the rise to power of rebel leader Juan Alvarez. He and his liberal cabinet, including Benito Juarez, instituted a series of reforms. Benito Juarez was different from all other previous leaders because, unlike the leaders of Spanish descent, he was born to Mesoamerican Indian parents. Yet, unlike others of Indian descent, he was also among the few who were educated. In 1857, he began to formulate a new constitution, establishing a federal as opposed to centralized form of government, and guaranteeing freedom of speech and universal male suffrage, among other civil liberties. For the first time since its independence, Mexico had leaders who wished to reform the government for the benefit of the people. Again, when talking about the people, it is important to note that it refers to those of Native American descent as well as African descent, who were the largest groups of Mexico's population. Other reforms focused on curtailing the power and wealth of the Catholic Church. Conservative groups bitterly opposed the new constitution for many reasons. In this context, again, it is important to note that those described as conservatives were of Spanish descent and until 1857 had controlled Mexico. The Catholic Church was one means of controlling the population. The new constitution threatened the power and influence of the wealthy class consisting of those with Spanish blood. Because the clergy was supporting the conservatives against the legal government, Juárez enacted several laws to curb ecclesiastical power. He nationalized all church property, exempting only those buildings actually used for worship and instruction. To weaken the clerical influence still further, he nationalized the cemeteries and put birth registrations and marriages under civil authority. Finally, the government separated church and state and guaranteed religious liberty to all citizens. Eventually, opposition to the new constitution resulted to civil war that would last 3 years starting in 1858. The war would devastate an already weakened Mexico. At the end of the war in 1861, Juárez emerged victorious. One of his first acts was to suspend payment on all of Mexico's debts to foreign governments. Juárez saw that Mexico's economic state was deteriorating, and he believed that pausing payments to foreign powers would help Mexico's economy. Europe panicked, and in an operation spearheaded by Francis Napoleon III, France, Great Britain, and Spain intervened to protect their investments in Mexico, occupying Veracruz. The British and Spanish soon withdrew, but Napoleon III sent his troops to occupy Mexico City, forcing Juárez and his government to flee in June of 1863. Napoleon III installed Maximilian, Archduke of Austria, on the throne of the Mexican Empire. At this point, not only was Mexico's economy much more unstable, but for 4 years they were ruled by a foreign power. The constant, impulsive decision of Mexico's leaders continued to stall social, economic, and political progress. In 1877, Mexico would again be impacted by various political changes. This same year, Porfirio Diaz gained control of Mexico after successfully leading a revolt against the Tejado, who was Juárez's successor. During the Diaz dictatorship, which lasted from 1877 through 1911, except for one 4-year stretch from 1880 to 1884, Mexico underwent tremendous commercial and economic development, based largely on Diaz's encouragement of foreign investment in the country. By 1910, most of the largest businesses in Mexico were owned by foreign nationals, mostly American or British. The modernizing reforms made the Diaz government turn Mexico City into a bustling metropolis, but they largely benefited the country's upper classes, not its poor majority. The fundamental inequality of Mexico's political and economic system breeds growing discontent, which will lead to revolution yet again. Mexico's poor were constantly left behind and deprived of opportunities to succeed. At this point, attempts to push reforms for the benefit of the poor resulted in conflict and only made Mexico more unstable. Though positive change seemed promising when Francisco Madero's revolutionary message spread, Mexico would actually fall into more chaos. Madero ran against Diaz, but lost. Madero was a liberal who called for democratic elections. He wrote a book titled La Sucesión Presidencial de 1910, which translates to the presidential succession of 1910. His message spread throughout the country, despite 90% of the population being illiterate. His revolutionary message made him known as the leader of the revolution. The Mexican Revolution officially started when Madero issued the Plan of San Luis Potosí, in which he promised democracy, federalism, agrarian reform, and workers' rights. He also declared war on the Diaz regime. By the following year, Madero's movement forced Diaz to step aside, and Madero was elected president. Madero's rule, however, did not bring peace to Mexico. He was interested in political reform that would keep the social and economic structure intact. Many revolutionaries were disappointed to learn that Madero would not bring the change they hoped to see. Opposition to his presidency sparked more revolution. Popular leaders of the peasants and working class emerged. Emiliano Zapata in southern Mexico and Pancho Villa in the north were the champions refusing to submit to presidential authority. Machado was eventually assassinated in 1913 by those who opposed his government. Conflict and violence continued for the better part of the next decade. General Victoriano Huerta, previously chief of Madero's own military, succeeded Madero, but continues opposition forced Huerta to resign. Another president controlled Mexico, and again, Villa and Zapata continued to wage war against the government. Eventually, the United States intervened because they were nervous about their unruly neighbor. America's involvement only further complicated matters. Despite the warring factions in Mexico, Carranza, Mexico's president at the time, was able to oversee the creation of a new liberal Mexican constitution in 1917. His efforts to maintain power, however, Carranza grew increasingly reactionary. He ordered the ambush and murder of Zapata in 1919 because he feared continuing opposition. The following year, Carranza was overthrown and killed by a group of his more radical generals. They were led by a man named Obregón, who was elected president and faced the task of reforming Mexico after 10 years of devastating revolution. By that time, nearly 900,000 Mexicans had immigrated to the United States since 1910, both to escape the violence and to find greater opportunities for work. Almost 100 years had passed since Mexico gained its independence, and corruption, instability, and war plagued Mexico. This could be attributed to the constant change in government that continuously failed to unite the country and favored one group of people. Finally, in 1923, Mexico again had a new president who tried to reform the country. After 3 years in power, the United States decided it would recognize Obregón's government, but only if he promised not to seize the holding American oil companies. Eager to be recognized by the United States and to avoid more conflict, Obregón agreed. In domestic affairs, however, Obregón put into place a series of agrarian reforms and gave official sanctions to organizations of peasants and laborers. He also instituted a sweeping educational reform led by José Vasconcelos, enabling the Mexican Cultural Revolution that began during this period. In 1944, Mexico had again another president, and his name was Manuel Ávila Camacho. During his presidency, Mexico had a closer relationship with the United States than it had in the past. Camacho agreed to Mexico would pay to the U.S. oil companies $24 million plus interest for properties expropriated. Also, under Camacho, Mexican politics would go through a period of demilitarization. Just after the administration of Ávila Camacho had begun, the military wing of the PRM disappeared. The army had become a professional institution that would be subordinate to the president. This trend, whereby the military stayed out of the party politics, became very apparent by 1946 when Miguel Alemán, 1846 through 1852, was elected as the first civilian post-revolutionary president. The PRM, as such, also ended in 1946 and became transformed into another party. It abandoned its names and programs that connected it to the Clandestine period to become the present-day Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI. However, after 1940, it would be economic capitalist growth based on a monolithic and authoritarian political system that would guide Mexico. In the process, the social structure that the revolutionaries were trying to create was abandoned, and social justice was no longer a great priority. One feature of the remarkable economic growth of Mexico was that labor lost ground to management. The distribution of income shows this trend. The percentage of income available to the poorer half of families in 1950 was 19%. In 1957, 16%. In 1963, 15%. And in 1975, only 13% of the total income of Mexico. In contrast, the top 20% of the wealthiest Mexicans in 1950 received 60% of the income. In 1958, 61. In 1963, 59. And in 1975, 63%. Wealth would be concentrated at the top after Cárdenas. After Cárdenas' economic policy was based on the questionable idea, which came from Obregón, that it was necessary to create wealth first and then later distribute it. Actually, there was much more support for the first stage and very little for the second. Things worsened for Mexican citizens because all attempts to reform the country socially were abandoned. Presidents would start to focus instead on creating wealth for the country, but would fail to distribute it to the common people. The Mexican government sought not to support its people, but instead to support itself. Mexico's political parties also began to play a great role in the development of the country. Mexico has 3 political parties. The first one of the 3 is known as the National Action Party. The National Action Party unites Catholics and capitalists in Mexico. It is a free market, conservative on social issues, and friendly to foreign interests. National Action Party was founded in 1935. Now, the second political party is known as the Democratic Revolutionary Party. It is the newest of the 3 political parties, with its founding dating to 1968, after the events that transpired against the people by the Mexican government. These events will be discussed later, but the PRD party was created by a generation of political thinkers who lost trust in the dominant party for good, and rumblings began for the creation of a new wing of progressive parties. The last of the political parties is the Institutional Revolutionary Party. It emerged as a consolidating force after the tumult of the Mexican Revolution. Over time, the PRI practically invented brand name politics. Its name, ideology, and even brand colors, same as the national flag, are directly linked to the very concept of the Mexican Republic. For many years, the party was the country, and the country was the party. The PRI developed a patronage system that virtually ensured electoral victory year after year. It soon became synonymous with corruption, disastrous financial mismanagement, and violent repression of dissent. The following video will provide details about the events that occurred one night in 1968, and those events changed the Mexican people's trust in the PRI, and it also changed the political party system.
In 1968, here was Paris, Chicago, Prague, and finally Mexico City. This plaza, the scene of another bloody confrontation. It had been building all summer. Mexican students were on the march, challenging an authoritarian government that claimed to be democratic. On the night of October 2nd, students filled the plaza. Soldiers with fixed bayonets surrounded them. Suddenly, without warning, a helicopter hovering overhead opened fire.
They wanted something called freedom, imagine. As simple as that. They wanted freedom, and they went out in the streets to demand this freedom. And the answer of the government was to mow them down on October 2nd, 1968, at Tlatelolco, the Plaza of the Three Cultures. Tlatelolco, the same place where Pedro de Alvarado had massacred the Aztecs in 1521.
The massacre, known as the Night of Sorrow, was the worst single disaster of 1968. But the world barely noticed. The Mexican government shrouded the massacre in secrecy. Only recently has it been officially acknowledged and investigated. But it was a turning point in Mexican history, the night when one-party rule lost whatever legitimacy it had.
The events of that night were a sign of corruption in the Mexican government and the lengths that the government would go to prevent and silence opposition. Yet it was not the last time the government would resort to such actions.